In a museum in Bad Kreuznach, Germany, there is a limestone block about 2 feet tall and 18 inches wide. Carved Latin, weathered edges, sitting in a display case like any other Roman military artifact. The inscription identifies its owner as Tiberius Julius Abdes Panthera, a Syrian-born archer who served in the Roman legions under the Emperor Augustus. The stone was dug out of the ground in October of 1859 by railroad workers laying track near Bingerbruck. Nobody was looking for anything specific. They hit the rock. They pulled it up. And then somebody who knew Latin read the name carved into it and realized that name had already appeared in an argument a 1700-year-old manuscript was trying to win. That name is the one the official story needed to disappear. Before I go any further, if this channel has ever made you stop and question something you were taught as unquestionable fact, hit like and subscribe. It helps the algorithm understand that this kind of investigation has value, and it's what allows me to keep digging into archives that most people never get handed in a classroom. Now, back to the stone. The manuscript I'm talking about is Origen of Alexandria's Contra Celsum, written around 248 AD. Origen, one of the most important early Christian theologians, a man who ran the catechetical school in Alexandria before eventually settling in Caesarea Maritima in modern-day Israel, where he produced an enormous output of biblical commentary and theological argument, sat down and wrote a point-by-point rebuttal of a pagan philosopher named Celsus, who had published an attack on Christianity somewhere around 175 AD. Celsus's original work is lost. We know what it said almost entirely because Origen quoted it before arguing against it. And one of the things Celsus said, preserved in Origen's book, chapter 28 through 32 of the first volume, was this: Mary had been turned out by her carpenter husband after being convicted of adultery. The man involved was a Roman soldier. His name was Panthera. That's the name on the gravestone. Now here's what makes this hard to dismiss as anti-Christian slander invented out of nothing. Celsus was writing around 175 AD. The canonical Gospels were being compiled and circulating in that same general period. This isn't a medieval rumor or a Renaissance-era conspiracy. This is a 2nd century, non-Christian source, roughly contemporary with the formation of the New Testament canon itself, accusing the nascent church of suppressing the biological identity of Jesus' father. And Origen, the theologian tasked with refuting it, didn't say Panthera was an invented name. He said the claim was wrong. Those are very different responses. You refute a lie by exposing the fabrication. You don't write 70 pages of careful theological argument against a name somebody made up on a Tuesday afternoon. This is where the investigation starts to pull in a direction the official story never points you toward. Let me build this from the foundation, because the foundation itself is already broken in ways nobody told me about for 12 years. Open the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 1. You get a genealogy. 42 generations from Abraham to Jesus, running through King David, running through a direct male lineage ending with Joseph. The purpose of that list is clear: to establish that Jesus is the legitimate heir of the Davidic line, the fulfillment of the messianic promise made to Israel. Joseph is the linchpin. Without Joseph's bloodline, the whole genealogical argument collapses. Now open the Gospel of Luke, chapter 3. You get a second genealogy, different names, different structure. Matthew goes from Abraham downward, Luke goes from Jesus upward, all the way to Adam. But more than the direction, the names between David and Joseph don't match. Matthew lists one set of ancestors. Luke lists a mostly different set. They share almost nothing in common for over 20 generations. 2 genealogies. One person they're supposed to be tracing. They disagree. Various explanations have been offered over the centuries. One traces Mary's line, one traces Joseph's, one is legal lineage, one is biological. But here's the problem. None of those explanations solves. Matthew 1, verse 16 says, and I'm quoting the text here, and Jacob begat Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom was born Jesus. Luke says Joseph's father was Heli. So, which is it, Jacob or Heli? These are not the same person. These are not ambiguous translations of the same Aramaic name. The texts disagree on the literal father of Joseph. That's not a minor discrepancy in a footnote. That's the load-bearing wall of the argument, and it has a crack in it that's been there since the texts were written. But here's where the story turns. Even if you accept both genealogies as somehow reconcilable, even if you grant every harmonization attempt ever made, you still have to answer the question the genealogies themselves are trying to avoid. They are tracing Joseph's bloodline. Both of them. To establish that Jesus is the son of David through Joseph. But the same texts tell you that Joseph was not Jesus's biological father. The virgin birth account, present in both Matthew and Luke, explicitly removes Joseph from the biological equation, which means those genealogies, both of them, are tracing a lineage that, by the theology of the same documents, Jesus did not inherit by blood. Origen saw the problem. He had to see it. He was one of the sharpest minds the early church ever produced. And Celsus, the pagan he was arguing against, had already pressed on exactly this point. If the divine father replaces Joseph biologically, then the genealogy through Joseph proves nothing about Jesus' identity, except that the narrative was constructed to satisfy a prophetic requirement that the biology had already voided. The genealogies aren't evidence of history. They're evidence of an argument that someone was trying to make. JJJJ. Benitez spent decades tracing exactly this kind of institutional seam. The place where doctrine and document don't quite line up, where the official story strains under the weight of the actual archive. What he kept finding, across manuscript after manuscript, was not fabrication so much as selective assembly. Not lies, exactly. Something more careful than that. Someone choosing which pieces of the record to preserve and which to let go silent. And the piece they most needed to go silent had a name carved in limestone. Let me tell you what else recorded that name. The Babylonian Talmud, compiled between the 2nd and 5th centuries AD, drawing on oral traditions and textual sources much older than the written compilation, contains several passages that refer to Jesus under alternative names. Tractate Sanhedrin, chapter 67, column 1. Tractate Shabbat, 104, column 2. The references use the terms Ben Stata and Ben Pandera, meaning son of Stata, son of Panthera. The texts are polemical. They're not sympathetic to the Christian narrative, but they're also not borrowing from Christian sources. They're drawing on a parallel Jewish record of the same historical period, a record that circulated entirely outside Christian control, preserved in rabbinic academies in Babylon, and reflects a counter-memory of Jesus' origins that was alive and specific enough to be written down in a legal and theological document of enormous authority within Judaism. Ben Pandera, son of Panthera. The specificity of that is worth sitting with for a moment. The Talmud is not a document known for imprecision. It is an exhaustively detailed compendium of legal argument, commentary, and tradition, produced by some of the most rigorous minds of the ancient world. When it names someone in a legal context, it names them with purpose. The appearance of the name Pandera in the Talmudic tradition, not as a passing reference, not as a footnote, but in tractates concerned with law and social category, suggests a name that was circulating in Jewish collective memory with enough concreteness to require formal treatment. This is not a myth. This is a legal category being applied to a specific individual. Now, skeptics have a standard response to all of this. The name Panthera, they argue, is simply a mocking pun on the Greek word parthenos, meaning virgin. The whole Panthera story in this reading is just a 2nd century joke at Christianity's expense, anti-Christian wordplay dressed up as a historical claim. No real soldier? No real name. Just a pagan philosopher being clever and nasty, and a rabbinical tradition picking up the punchline. It's a reasonable argument. It has only one problem. In October of 1859, railroad workers near Bingerbruck pulled a limestone block out of the ground. Tiberius Julius Abdes Panthera, archer, first cohort of archers, from Sidon in the Roman province of Syria, served in Judea under Augustus, and subsequently transferred to the Rhine frontier, where he died and was buried during the reign of Tiberius. The stone is catalogued as Cil Athrin, 7514 in the Corpus Inscriptionum Latinorum, the definitive academic registry of Roman inscriptions. The original is displayed in the Römerhalle Museum in Bad Kreuznach, Germany. You can go look at it. Panthera was not a pun. Panthera was a real name attached to a real soldier from Sidon in Syria, stationed in the right region, Judea, in the right historical window, during the reign of Augustus, which overlaps precisely with the period in which Jesus would have been conceived. The "it was just a Greek joke" theory does not survive the tombstone, and this matters enormously because it shifts what we're looking at. If Celsus invented a name, he invented a story. If Panthera was a real person with a real military posting in Judea, then Celsus wasn't inventing anything. He was reporting something that existed, somewhere in a tradition that predated his writing by at least a generation. A tradition that the Church spent the next 17 centuries working very hard to contain. I need to pause here for a second, because I'm aware of what this sounds like. I'm aware it sounds like the kind of thing you read on a conspiracy website at 2 in the morning, sandwiched between articles about the Illuminati and crop circles. But I want to be clear about something. I'm not telling you that Panthera was the father of Jesus. I'm telling you that the documentary record shows that a named Roman soldier, whose tombstone exists in a museum you can visit, was accused in a 2nd century source of being Jesus's biological father, and that the Church's institutional response across centuries was not to explain or refute the evidence, but to ban the documents that contained it. That is not a conspiracy theory. That is a paper trail. Jane Schauberg, the biblical scholar whose 1987 book, The Illegitimacy of Jesus, remains one of the most rigorously sourced examinations of pre-gospel traditions, argued something that the theological establishment found extremely uncomfortable: that the earliest textual layers in Matthew chapter 1 and Luke chapter 1 do not describe a miraculous divine conception at all. They describe an illegitimate pregnancy. A pregnancy Joseph chose to accept, to adopt legally, to protect Mary under the legal and social conventions of 1st century Jewish life. Schauberg's reading of the Greek is careful and detailed. She works through the actual verb forms and grammatical structures of the original text, not the translated versions that became dominant in Western Christianity. Her sources are primary. Her argument is methodologically sound, and the institutional response to her work was not rigorous academic counter-argument. It was a fire set to her car in her university parking lot, and a sustained campaign to remove her from her faculty position at the University of Detroit Mercy in Detroit, Michigan. She kept her job, she kept her conclusions, but the message was delivered. I want to stay with that for a moment. Jane Schauberg was a tenured professor at a Catholic university. She published a peer-reviewed academic book examining the original Greek of the New Testament. Someone set fire to her car. That is what the evidence produced when a scholar applied careful methodological analysis to the birth narratives and arrived at a conclusion that the institution found threatening. Not a rebuttal. Not a counter-argument. A fire in a parking lot. How confident do you have to be in your position to respond to scholarship that way? Now, forget everything I just said about scholarly arguments for a moment. Because the most revealing evidence in this case isn't a theory. It's a list, the Decretum Gelasianum, traditionally attributed to Pope Gelasius I around 496 AD, though modern scholarship, including the detailed analysis by Ernst von Dobschütz, identifies it more precisely as an anonymous compilation from somewhere between 519 and 553 AD, is one of the earliest official documents in which the institutional church made explicit what was and was not permitted to be read. It is a catalog, a banned books list, and among the texts it specifically names as forbidden, not merely discouraged, not merely unofficial, but explicitly forbidden to be read by Christians, is the Gospel of James. The Gospel of James, the Protevangelium of James, a birth narrative, a text that offered a different account of Mary's background, her origins, the circumstances of her pregnancy, and the human world surrounding the moment Jesus was born. The Church didn't ignore it. It didn't simply fail to include it in the canon. It named it and banned it. This is the key thing. You don't ban a text that poses no threat. You don't compile an official list and put something on it unless that something is circulating, unless people are reading it, unless the information it contains is finding an audience that you have decided must not find it. The Decretum Galasianum exists because the alternative birth narratives existed, and because they were being read, widely enough that somebody had to write them down on a list and say, "Not these, never these." What were they saying? We don't have a complete version of every banned birth gospel. Some survive in fragments, some survive only in references. Origen quoting Celsus, early church fathers mentioning texts they were arguing against, scribes noting in margins that certain documents had been removed from circulation. But the picture that assembles from the pieces is consistent. There was a tradition, pre-canonical, circulating in Jewish Christian communities in the 1st and 2nd centuries, drawing on memories and sources that predated the compilation of the canonical Gospels, that told a different story about who Jesus' father was. Not a theological story, a human story, an uncomfortable human story about a woman in a vulnerable position and a man who chose to stand beside her. And that story, for institutional reasons that Robert Eisenman's work on the Dead Sea Scrolls and the early Jerusalem community analyzed extensively, had to be replaced. Eisenman documented something that doesn't get discussed in Sunday school: the systematic effort by 2nd and 3rd century church editors to minimize, dilute, and eventually erase the dynastic human bloodline of Jesus and his family, including the prominence of James, Jesus' brother, whose leadership of the Jerusalem community after the crucifixion was a major historical fact attested in Josephus, in Paul's letters, and in early church tradition that the later institutional church found deeply inconvenient. If Jesus had a brother, a biological brother, born of the same mother, then Mary was not a perpetual virgin. If Mary was not a perpetual virgin, the virginity dogma falls. And if the virginity dogma falls, the entire architecture of divine biological origin falls with it. So the brother gets minimized, the alternative birth texts get banned, the Roman soldier's name gets dismissed as a pun, and the genealogies, 2 of them, contradicting each other on the literal father of Joseph, get taught in Catholic schools in Indiana as bedrock evidence of an unbroken divine lineage. I taught those genealogies for 12 years. I taught Matthew chapter 1 and Luke chapter 3 as if the discrepancies weren't there. I stood in front of rooms full of teenagers in Evansville and treated Joseph's bloodline as the answer to a question nobody had asked, because the question itself had been removed from the curriculum before anyone thought to put it in. I don't know what I would have done if a student had asked me, "If the virgin birth is real, why do we need Joseph's genealogy at all?" I genuinely don't know. I didn't have an answer for that. I still don't. And I've been sitting with that specific not knowing for a long time now. There's a moment I keep coming back to. It was a Thursday morning, sometime in the late 90s. I'd been teaching for maybe 4 or 5 years at that point. Hadn't yet started asking the questions that would eventually push me out of the building. A girl in one of my junior year classes, maybe 16, raised her hand during the Matthew genealogy section and asked very simply, "Why does this list matter if Joseph wasn't really the father?" And I gave her the answer I had been given: the standard harmonization, the legal lineage, the adoptive father, the fulfillment of prophecy through the legal relationship rather than the biological one. She nodded. She wrote it down. I moved on, and something in me knew, even then, that the answer I had given her was not the answer to the question she had actually asked. She was asking, "Does the story hold together?" And the honest answer, if I had known how to be honest about it then, was no. Not completely. Not if you read both genealogies side by side with the birth account in between. I still don't understand why that was something I wasn't supposed to notice. I've never understood it. Here's what I do know. The record shows that in the 2nd century, roughly 175 AD, a pagan philosopher named Celsus published a document naming a Roman soldier as Jesus's biological father. The record shows that an early Christian theologian, writing from his scriptorium in Caesarea Maritima around 248 AD, spent considerable effort producing a detailed counter-argument rather than simply dismissing the claim as invented. The record shows that a Sidonian archer named Tiberius Julius Abdes Panthera, posted in Judea during the correct historical window, existed and has a gravestone in a museum in Germany. The record shows that the Babylonian Talmud, drawing on independent Jewish tradition compiled outside Christian control, referred to Jesus as son of Panthera in multiple tractates of enormous legal and scholarly authority. The record shows that the Church compiled official banned book lists specifically targeting alternative birth narratives, naming them explicitly, which means those narratives were circulating. The record shows that biblical scholars who analyzed the original Greek texts and found evidence of a pre-gospel tradition describing an illegitimate pregnancy faced not scholarly rebuttal, but institutional retaliation, including arson. That's not a conspiracy. That's the record. What the record does not tell you, and I want to be honest about this because I spent too many years being dishonest about what the evidence actually proves, is whether Celsus was right. We don't know that. The gravestone proves the name was real. It doesn't prove the relationship. The Talmudic passages are polemical, written by people who had reasons to discredit the Christian narrative. Origen's counter-argument was motivated, written by someone who had reasons to defend it. Scheiberg's reading is rigorous, but contested. The banned texts are incomplete. What we know is not what happened. What we know is what was suppressed, and suppression, by definition, is not what you do to stories that pose no threat. But here's where Benitez's lens becomes essential. He spent his career asking a different kind of question than the one theology was prepared to answer. Not, what did God do? But, what happened to the human being at the center of this? The human Jesus. The human Mary. The human Joseph, who, according to the earliest gospel accounts, encountered a situation that the texts describe with notable emotional delicacy. A man who was going to divorce his betrothed quietly, privately, to protect her from public humiliation, before a dream changed his decision. That's not the behavior of a man who was told his fiancée was carrying the Son of God in a way that made the situation theologically clear. That reads like the behavior of a man who knew something true and painful and was trying to handle it with as much grace as he could manage. The text gives you the emotion of a man navigating a real human crisis, and then it hands you a theological explanation that removes the crisis entirely. Benitez kept asking, which version of the story is the one where the human beings in it behave like human beings? That question isn't heresy. It's the most honest reading of the text available. If you've been following this channel for any length of time, you know that Benitez spent his career finding the human architecture underneath the theological scaffolding. The suppressed evidence about Panthera is exactly the kind of thing he was pointing toward. Not to destroy faith, but to insist that truth, whatever it is more interesting and more human and more worth protecting than the institutional version was allowed to be. The name they buried wasn't a metaphor, it was carved in limestone and covered with 18 centuries of soil near a railroad track in Germany, and railroad workers found it by accident. And now it sits in a museum display case in Bad Kreuznach, and it has been sitting there for over 160 years. For those of you who've asked where to go deeper after watching, the pinned comment below points to something I put together on the other side of these questions. Make of it what you will. But before we close this out, I want to sit with the full weight of what this actually means. Because I think it's easy to hear a video like this and treat it as intellectual entertainment, a puzzle, a mystery, something fascinating and safely historical, something that happened a long time ago and doesn't touch your life now, and then close the tab and go back to your day. But if this record is accurate, if the alternative birth accounts were real, if the suppression was real, if the institutional effort to eliminate a specific human truth about a specific person was sustained and deliberate across 17 centuries, then what you were taught was not the result of scholarship pursuing evidence. It was the result of institutions managing a story. And the story they were managing has been sitting in your head since childhood, labeled as bedrock, labeled as the thing you weren't supposed to question. The genealogies don't match. The stone is in a museum. Origen wrote 70 pages arguing against a name that, we now know, belonged to a real person. None of that is conspiracy. All of it is in the record. And there's one thing about all of it that I genuinely cannot reconcile, and I've tried. I have sat with this particular question for years, the way you sit with something that won't resolve, that keeps surfacing at inconvenient moments when you thought you'd put it away. Why did Origen bother? He was writing for an educated Greco-Roman audience in Caesarea around 248 AD. He was a theologian of enormous capability, a man who had the entire Jewish scriptural tradition in his head in multiple languages, who had produced more written work than almost any figure in the ancient world. He had every intellectual tool available to a brilliant 3rd century mind. And the most effective thing he could have done with Celsus's Panthera claim, if it was simply a pagan fabrication, a wordplay joke, an invented insult with no traction in historical memory, was to dismiss it in a sentence. Mock it! Point at the invented nature of the whole thing and move on. That's what you do with a baseless rumor. You demonstrate that it's baseless and you move on. Instead, he spent 4 chapters of Book 1 on it. 4 careful, detailed, theologically loaded chapters of argument. He walked through the accusation piece by piece. He engaged it as if it were an argument worth taking seriously, because it was circulating widely enough among educated non-Christians that he could not afford to simply wave it away. That's not how you respond to nothing. That's how you respond to something that's circulating widely enough that ignoring it is no longer an option. That's how you respond to a name that people already know. The question the official story buried is the question that keeps answering itself every time you look at the archive with both eyes open. Now I want to know what you think. I've laid out the record as carefully and honestly as I can, and I've tried to be clear about where the evidence ends and the uncertainty begins. Tell me in the comments. Where does this land for you? Does the archaeological and textual record change how you read the Gospels, or do you think the institutional suppression argument overstates what we can actually conclude from the available evidence? I'm genuinely asking because I've been arguing with myself about this for years, and the conversations in the comments on this channel are consistently sharper and more honest than anything I arrive at by myself. Drop your take below. I read every single one.